Good evening, all, and welcome to Chapter 11. We're down to the final few weeks of class, so hopefully everything's going well for all of you. So this chapter, we're going to spend talking about government intervention in agricultural markets. We'll look at the Farm Bill, the last Farm Bill, at least that was covered by your textbook, and we'll talk a little bit about history of government intervention. There's a lot of definitions and program and laws and agencies defined in the chapter. Obviously, you're not expected, especially in this class, to memorize any of them, but just trying to understand the general narrative of what the government's tried to do since really the 1930s in agriculture, in our agricultural sector, is really the purpose of this chapter. And it's by no means a complete overview even of what government interventions have occurred. It's just a highlight of some of the major things that have happened. Our government and governments around the world have been really heavily involved in intervening in agricultural production for a long time, oftentimes under justification that, agricultural commodities and goods provide for basic needs. And by their nature, most agricultural goods are very inelastic, meaning people have to have them, right? And so if that's the case, well, imagine the social unrest if the government can't ensure that grain stores are stocked and people can eat and not starve to death, right? That leads to a lot of political instability and collapse of governments and transition and turmoil throughout history. So there is a strong interest. We won't get into it in this class, but if we were looking at developmental economics and looking at countries that are known as either historically we call them third world, that was found a meaning. So now we call them least developed countries or lower development countries, LDCs. But if we're looking at those countries, a lot of these countries also involved in furthering their economy by heavily manipulating the agricultural sector to limit the amount of involvement to free up capital allocations for technological goods and production. So you look at countries like Taiwan or Vietnam or even Thailand, where agriculture production was huge, and over time there's been a slow but steady shift away from agricultural production writ large, more concentrated agricultural sectors in the hands of few, in favor of diverting those resources and capital allocations into what are believed to be higher value technological targets, right? So and that goes by a name of industrial-led development. So without much further ado, we'll try to hit what's going to happen. So as always, these are learning objectives. Feel free to pause and read those. And on a lot of these word-heavy slides, I'm not going to go through and read everything. I'll just ask you to pause on some of these slides because I don't think anyone really wants to hear me read what you can read for yourself. And the book does go into quite a bit more detail. So the farmer and the farm problem in economics is explained by a few things happening. One just said is there's inelastic demand, right? And so what that means is people have to have the product, they're willing to pay for it. They will substitute across agricultural commodities, but if we're in a severe drought and everything's in short supply, the price of everything rises, and that leads to some peculiarities in the economy. So if we think about the Irish potato famine, right? Everything, all food products in Ireland were in short supply due to a famine. So even potatoes were suffering in production, but the price of potatoes climbed. Why? Because as the amount of all agricultural commodities declined, including potatoes representing the cheapest of the agricultural products, the price was bid up from increasing demand, right? People were substituting for cheaper and cheaper crops until they got to the cheapest crop, and then the price of that crop had to rise, right? And it's an interesting phenomenon. Some economists believe this produces a deviation from the law of demand, right? As price goes down, price goes up, the law of demand says that quantity demanded should go down. But in this case, price of potatoes goes up and the quantity demanded increases. I would say this is actually due to a shift in the demand curve, right, from substitution effects. But some economists have said, look, this represents, a different class of goods. And there's been some debate in economic circles whether that's really the case or not. Obviously, you know where I stand. So when you have inelastic demand, if there's an increase in productivity and you end up with a bumper crop, or there's just even good weather for creating that, it's not really productivity in that sense, but creating that bumper crop, then that can drive prices low really quick. If you doubt that, just draw up a supply and demand curve. I haven't done this often this semester, mainly because it doesn't show up well, but if we draw that supply and demand curve, I need some liquid, but anyway, I'm going to stop the screen share and unblur my background. You guys can all see my messy office. Sorry about this. Okay, so if we have my little dry erase board and we've got quantity and we have price, and say this is any ag commodity, corn, for example. And so we have a fairly inelastic demand curve, and we have a supply curve that looks like this, right? So if the supply curve shifted out here because there was just a good growing season, right? Nothing else. Farmers didn't choose to plant more, anything else, they just got higher than expected yields. So the result of all this good luck on the part of the farmer would be that price and quantity would have been here at the O part, the initial, and now price was driven down and quantity only marginally increased, right? So this represents a big problem, right? Because farmers are then going to say, hey, we lost all of this revenue right here. This all goes away, right? And why? Because we had better than we were expecting rain, right? So this represents a big problem in farming. So let's go back to that screen share. Okay, so next problem, there's a lack of market power, right? We've talked about this before. There's a lot of farms, even though there's large corporate farms, there's still, not a monopoly in the farming space or an oligopoly. Plenty of corn farmers out there to create competition. And so that competition, everyone jostling it around, amplifies this problem. And then there's sensitivity to trends in interest rates and international trade conditions that are beyond the farmer's control, right? So if the interest rates change because of other factors in the economy, the carrying costs of loans in the farmer's portfolio could go through the roof. We're seeing that right now in terms of commodity with interest rates. It's definitely put a it's definitely put a temporary freeze on sales of certain equipment, right? So I've been listening on the trade publications, and we're seeing that there is decreased interest because of higher interest rates in new farm equipment. Farmers are saying, look, I got to finance this loan at really high interest rates. Is it really worth it? Do I need this new tractor? Do I need this new combine? Whatever. So they have to make that trade-off, right? And a lot of farmers live off of their debt, right? They live off of their assets that are locked up, and they borrow against those assets and live on that money. And when the interest rate goes up, that means there's less money to live on. International trade conditions, at the drop of a hat or a tweet, a president can alter the way agricultural products trade in international settings. There can be problems in a crop if there's just a hint that there's an issue with mad cow disease, for example. Then all of a sudden Japan and most of European Union will lock down their markets and not allow for imports from the impacted country. If that was the US, we're locked out of those markets, and all of a sudden there's a glut of beef in our marketplace, right? So all these things can occur. And then there's asset fixity leads to excess capacity. What's that mean? It means most of the farmers have their assets tied up in illiquid ways, right? Ag land isn't easy and quick to move, especially parts of it. In fact, zoning regulations might make it difficult to just split part of your farm and sell only a little bit to meet predator demands or to increase income. Tractors, there is a market for used product, but the market is extremely, the older the product, the less value that item holds, right? It will sell, but it's not going to sell near for what you bought for it, right? So what happens is you end up with this excess land, you end up with excess equipment, and the farmer says, well, regardless of what's happening, if I've got all of these assets, I might as well use them, right? I think I talked a little bit about my friend who did ranching, now does farming in Merced County, and he was in a use it or lose it. He had a large asset, which was California water rights. He was worried he would lose it if he didn't use it, so he started using that water, and that produced more and more product, right? And more output. So So the most recent farm bill when this book was produced was 2015-18 cycle farm bill. Should have Googled this before I started, but not positive that there's been actually a new one passed since then. That's a big issue. It would surprise me if there wasn't, but maybe not, because Congress been kind of effed up for a while. So we'll see. But starting with 2015, crop insurance plays a big role in countering price and yield risk. Producers can purchase subsidized crop insurance that covers major price and yield risk. And the crop insurance companies are guaranteed against major losses by the federal government, right? So it's almost viewed as the government is your catastrophe insurance, right? So the government says, look, crop insurance companies, you do your thing, but if there's a major failure, an asteroid hits and wipes out all of the crops in Nebraska and Iowa, we're going to make sure you're whole in this. We're not going to make you go under. So it is what it is. Okay. So the role of farm legislation historically has been to support farm prices, and income's been historically focused on the major commodities. So most of our crop subsidies are in corn, wheat, soybeans, cotton, rice. There are also minor crop programs and dairies covered under other federal programs. But a lot of the boutique crops, as I like to call them, tomatoes, cantaloupes, melons, pumpkins, things like that, tend to not get as much coverage, right? And so farmers in those areas technically are running a lot more risk. But we'll look at some of the provisions even in this chapter where farmers are able to use what they could have grown instead of what they actually grow to represent what they're insuring. And that's a little weird, right? That's like saying, I drive a 1979 Ford Pinto, but insure me as if I'm driving a Ferrari, right? We don't tend to do that in insurance markets, but there is some ability to kind of manipulate this on the farmer side. So, and it's legal. So, major focus of this part of the book is to look at those major crop commodity supports, including the CCC, which is the commodity, what is that? CCC is, sorry about that, Commodity Credit Corporation. Very good. And but a lot of the goal is to look at that Commodity Credit Corporation non-recourse loan approach and the set-aside approaches, right, as just an example of what's happening. So is what it is. So first thing, what's the effect of that bumper crop, right? And so I already drew this on the board, so you know this, but that bumper crop moves us from supply curve 1 to supply curve 2, and it drops that price and increases quantity. So we'll go on. So what's the importance of elasticity? Well, you can see if the good was inelastic, looking at D2, the impact on price is a lot, and quantities is a lot less than if the price is inelastic, that D1 curve, right? The more vertical curve. You see that one results in a huge price drop and barely a budge, not even a huge budge in the amount of increased demand for the item based on the higher price, right? So, this is the problem that the farmer faces. So the first approach we'll cover and look through some of the graphs of how this impacts is the Commodity Credit Corporation making loans to farmers. The value is set to the collateral. The price of the commodity is the value, and that's called the loan rate. So what we'll say is the USDA says, okay, here's how much the commodity price is, and then we're going to compare that with what it really is. So the farmer can sell the crop at the market price is above the anticipated rate, and they can repay that loan. And if the price at market is lower when they actually harvest, then the farmer surrenders their crop to the USDA, and in return, the farmer receives the guarantee amount, right? The loan rate, what they were allowed to get. So this Commodity Credit Corporation the USDA starts in the 1930s. It expands it to things like dairy in 1949. And the idea is that the government's going to take any excess supply and they're going to absorb that. And in fact, what the government really does is they put all of these goods into warehouses. And you might ask yourself, how many warehouses? Well, when I was young, there was this thing called government cheese, and that's had various roles throughout history. But the reality is the government stockpiles various amounts of product they store this product in lots of places, but a big place they store it is actually, I was reading an article on this, and maybe we'll put this in the lesson from Modern Farmer, but they use cold storage in caves outside of Kansas City, Missouri. And just so in case you wanted to know, in 2014, the US government showed that they had 1.5 billion pounds of excess cheese in storage. I want you to think about that, 1.5 billion pounds of cheese from farmers. That stuff is really salty. It's not very tasty. They also have 355 million pounds of butter, 211 million pounds of pecans, and a little less than 1 billion pounds of French fries. They also store other things, right? They're also going to store powdered milk, evaporated milk. They'll store almost anything that farmers surrender, right? Which is a little scary when you think about it. But this is a huge amount of storage capacity. And so effectively, if the demand curve's at D, then what happens is the farmer ends up with more supply, right? So the government's going to guarantee that they're going to buy that excess supply. And so that means that when they have increased supply, there's no demand, right? The demand doesn't need to change. The demand changes from the government stepping in and taking that excess supply, right? So if we just had the free market price at PF and quantity at QF, we'd be at this that point E, the elasticity, or sorry, equilibrium point. But because the government's going to step in and buy if the price at free market isn't above the loan price, right? And so the loan price would have been, this example, been 6, then that means that the price floor is effectively at 6. And the government's going to take all of that excess supply. And when the price is 6, consumers actually want less. So that means that point from QF to QD, the quantity demanded versus quantity at free market, that's excess supply that the government has to purchase because they left the price high, right? So not only is the government guaranteeing a higher price, taking that supply, they're also decreasing the amount of quantity that's consumed by the general public, right? Which is a little interesting way of thinking about it. Now, there's been a lot written on whether these programs benefit farmers, how much they really cost. There's a lot of storage costs, things like that. And the end result is that maybe, think through the logic here. If the government gives someone a pound of cheese, right, when the government in the past has handed out some of these crops to food pantries, for example, does that mean that the industry sells a pound less of cheese? Well, it just depends. If the person didn't have money to buy cheese in the first place, there's really no net change from the program, right? If the person would have bought half a pound, but now gets a pound from the government and doesn't buy any, then that decreased demand by another half pound, right? So whether there's real impacts is very hard because this is such a convoluted policy, right? Very difficult to analyze at the end of the day. So I'll let you guys track through the producer and consumer surpluses. They're pretty easy to kind of model, and your book does this quite well in the PowerPoint. So the CCC needs to store the surplus from quantity demanded at that $6 price to the quantity the government's going to have. And it costs the taxpayers a lot of money. In fact, there were some examples back in the 80s where people from USDA were like, look, we've got millions of pounds of rotting cheese, right? And they were bringing buckets of moldy, nasty American cheese because even though they're trying to store it, they're trying to create formulations that are high salt content that are going to last longer. They've been storing cheese in these bunkers since I believe cheese since 1949, right? So this is a long time to keep some of this cheese. And there's literally millions of pounds of it that just end up rotting from age, right? Doesn't do anyone any good. In fact, you could almost argue it's really so hyper inefficient and environmentally wasteful and stupid, but that's a story for another time in another class. So this approach has an unwanted effect. It increases supply, right? So the producer is going to supply. Actually, I actually hate the way your book said that. It's not going to necessarily increase supply. It's just the farmers look at it and they set it relative to that loan rate, right? And they say, look, if we're going to get 6, this is what we're targeting. And then what happens is because they're seeing that higher price, they might actually allocate more resources to producing it, right? And then if the yields are even better than they thought they were going to be, there's an increase in supply. There are so many things that factor into supply, not just planning in terms of crop planning. In fact, we see this a lot. The USDA comes out with these reports, says, look, we're down on planting, and yet the yields are up on the year, right? And that's because technology changes, weather can be different. You know, from a technology perspective, farmers have been squeezing more and more yield out of land over time. It is kind of crazy. So the increase in the CCC acquired stocks, which pulls up the price from the price at free market to the price at government, at PF to PG, causes the participating farmers to increase their production higher than they would have done, you know, in the face of more uncertainty, right? And we could argue, look, the government's really saying this is a national security thing. We want to guarantee farmers enough to cover their costs, right? To make sure that they're going to provide the crop so that we're not left with people starving, right? So really that goal of removing risk is to create security. And it's up to you, you know, this more political or philosophical, moral, religious question over whether these policies are good. We know they're inefficient, but maybe the inefficiency is outweighed by the benefit they provide society. So this is the loan rate approach, right, from the CCC. So we also have this set-aside approach. And the idea of set-aside is the government's going to say, and you might have heard people talk about this in the past, I know I did when I was younger, which is the government pays farmers not to grow, right? And so part of the set-aside is the government says, look, we're going to ask you to set aside land, let it go fallow, not produce as much. One of the difficulties with the set-aside approach is it's up to the farmer to decide which land goes fallow, right? Which one's not producing. And so if you're a farmer, are you going to set aside your most productive land or your least productive land? I know what I'm doing. And so oftentimes the policymakers are at a disadvantage. They don't have the information that farmers do on the ground. And so they're paying up for farmers to produce less theoretically, but the farmers are gaming the system. They're going to give you the shitty land, the crappy land first. And they're going to take that crappy land and give it to the government. And then they're going to take their best land and reserve it for production, right? And this creates some problems. And so this has the effect of changing the elasticity of supply, not shifting the curve, right? And so we're actually just rotating this curve up and making it steeper and taking land out of production for growing. I'll let you go through and look at the welfare effects on your own just by pausing this or looking in your textbook. Okay, so you guys can go through this as well. The benefit of this approach is it does not encourage more production, right? It will take away production. It's just the policymakers have a difficult time predicting how much production is going to be removed in this approach. That's the big issue with this one. So the individual producer that participates in this program will reduce their acreage planted from quantity F to quantity G, right? The free market to the government. In some instances, this has led to a 20-25% reduction in acreage. Participating producer qualified for deficiency payments. The program's not popular with the input supply sector. It's not popular with the people that provide good services to farmers, right? It also, I'm going to be honest, isn't popular with public, right? This idea that people are getting paid to do nothing, right? Even if maybe it does result in a good outcome for the consumer and for the government, right? But it is what it is. Then we have this idea of deficiency payments that comes around, right? And so all of these ideas are built upon each other, and some of them are laid over each other at various points in time. Sometimes they're rescinded. And I just want to say, from a policy analysis perspective, this is very difficult to track what's going to happen. But the idea with the deficiency payments was to equal the quantity M. And so they're going to multiply by the difference between the announced target price and either the loan rate or the market price, whichever one's higher, right? So if the loan rate ends up higher, then that's the one that goes first. If the market price is higher, that's the one that's counted. And so the idea is that the government sets this kind of target price. If the market price and the loan rate are below the target price, the government makes that up. And the idea here is it's tied to the producer's base acres associated with your historic planted acres. So it's not about what you're planting today, it's about what you've planted in the past, right? So this is where I was saying sometimes you can substitute out goods, which creates some problems as well. Then we have this counter-cyclical program. The Farm Bill in 2002 introduced this. The idea was to restore some of these safety nets that were eliminated in the 96 Farm Bill. It's tied to a difference between the target price and the effective price. The effective price is the national price and the sum of the loan rate and the direct payment rate. So if the free market price is equal to target price, there's no payment, right? If the market price is greater than the target price, there's no payment. It's only if the target price is greater than the free market price, the payment received is the difference between the two. And then the total payment is going to increase producer surplus, right? So let you read about Title I and Title 11, but Title I, farmers are asked to make a one-time choice between two safety net options. You can choose your agricultural risk coverage or your price loss coverage, right? Two different methods. Under Title 11, crop insurance for programs like corn and wheat is allowed for supplemental coverage, while stacked income production plan was available to cotton producers. The bill eliminates direct payment features in previous bills. Basically, the government's not going to do it. They're going to go through a subsidiary. So other titles in the Farm Bill dealt with specific aspects related to conservation, energy, trade, nutrition, other things. The largest portion of Farm Bill is related to SNAP, historically known as food stamps. That accounts for 80% of the spending under Farm Bill. Another huge program is WIC, Women, Infants, and Children, which provides for payments to, well, provides for not really payments, but money for mothers to use to and children to buy basic items like dairy. It includes milk, cheese, milk products, sorry, cheese, can include vegetables, formula, things like this. Just depends on the nature. So producers no longer receive those fixed payments per acre. The counter-cyclical payments are also eliminated at that time. The PLC program makes a payment to the producer when the market price is below a fixed reference price shown below. So you've got these reference prices: corn $3.70 a bushel, sorghum $3.96, soy $8.40, rice $14, wheat $5.50. Let me just tell you right now, these numbers probably, hopefully, have been adjusted a little based on year, but all of these prices, corn's currently what, like $5.47 a bushel, so quite a bit higher than the reference price and the loan rate. Okay, the payment rates given by the rate equals to the reference price minus the higher of the U.S. average market year price and marketing loan rates. The total PLC payment is the payment rate times payment yield on 85% of the farm's base acres, right? Remember, we're not trying to make farmers whole. We're just trying to help them out, make it offset so that they can stay in business and produce in the future. Producers choosing the PLC option can also select supplemental coverage option when making their crop insurance decisions. So a payment is capped at $125,000 per person or legal entity, $250,000 for a husband and a spouse, right? If you've got the ARC, you can use two programs. So there's a county program. Payments are made when actual revenue for a covered commodity is less than the ARC guarantee. Let you read through the rest. And then there's the ARC individual, and that's going to be tied, covers the crop, all crops on the farm if elected. Revenue benchmark in this case is based on the Olympic average of the historical revenue for the most recent 5 years. Payments tied to the minimum spread between the ARC revenue guarantee and actual revenue, 10% of the benchmark. So a little bit of summary, you've got the two different programs, agricultural risk coverage and the price loss coverage that are available to farmers. So the federal crop insurance program is administered by the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation. It's a part of the USDA. The risk management agency of the USDA administers the functioning of the program. They established a program standard, set the premium rates, and approve new insurance products. They also determine the discount and subsidy levels for premiums. Private crop insurance programs or companies market policies, producers collect the premiums and determine the extent of losses. Crop insurance is cornerstone of farm safety net. It's really about alleviating risks to the farmers so that they stay in business and produce into the future, which provides the social good. There's approximately 290 million acres of crops under federal crop insurance policies, protecting 100 billion in crops. The agents work for private insurers, providers, sell policies to the producers. The approved providers ultimately provide the compensation. let's take a step back. There's a standard reinsurance agreement with the FCIC. Reinsurance kind of interesting, but a little too difficult to get into in this class. You've got catastrophic risk protection endorsement. That just means if you've got a total loss or almost a total loss, it's going to help you. Multiple peril crop insurance insures against natural disasters. You can choose which yield coverage and the price. Premium depends on different things. Okay. And then we have revenue insurance plans as well. So let you guys read about that. If you're really interested, you can kind of go look through all the different policies available. Okay, so if we're handling so now we're going to get to enhancing value added. The idea here is that the government also enacts other policies, right? So the example the book's giving is that they use starch-based ethanol. I don't know why they say it that way. Corn, right? And so there's also been a recent change to that program that's moving it to soybean, right? But that didn't exist in 2018 when your textbook was written. But soy is now going to be utilized for ethanol as well. But historically, it's been corn. And so the argument is if we're, allowing for some switches, what's going to happen? And I'll let you guys look through this, but the idea is they're increasing demand, right? Because now you don't just have consumers wanting corn and other food manufacturers. Now you have energy companies wanting corn because they're required to have ethanol, which is derived from farm product, in their fuel blends, right? So I'll let you look through the welfare effects and producer consumer and societal surplus, but definitely society gains from this is the argument. You can also look at government policies related to subsidizing food purchases by lower income countries. US government will provide subsidies that other countries can import, say, wheat or other grain products. And that's going to effectively create a shift out in demand as well. And I'll let you look through the producer-consumer surpluses and where they accrue. Do they occur to foreigners, to us? Who benefits? So just the summary, you guys can look through these, but very short and sweet. So hopefully this was a little interesting waylay into a little bit about a 1,000+ page bill, and we've whittled it down to 33 PowerPoint slides. So we really, just kind of hit the tip of the iceberg in terms of what the government does in terms of economic intervention in farming, but hopefully gave you an idea of how economists actually model these changes over time. So thanks a lot. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out and ask. Thank you very much.